Hello, Mr. K here with another video for all the boys and girls and any moms and dads that want to watch. We're going to start out today with a verse. We usually have a memory verse. This one would be a good one to memorize because, well, it's from the book of Psalms, Psalm 100, verses 1 and 2. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. The Psalms have the whole creation celebrating God. Someday that will be true in heaven. It's true today. It says, serve the Lord with gladness. It's a privilege to be God's child. It's a privilege to serve Him. It's a privilege to just belong to Him and build His kingdom. Come before His presence with singing. Oh, to be with God's people when they sing praises to God, that's a wonderful thing, and I enjoy that very much. Well, today, let's pray right before our story, and we'll get right to it. Dear Father, I pray for your help. I pray for the help of each one listening, that they may be benefited by the words. Would you help me have the right words and help them have the right hearing to understand and believe? For Christ's sake, in His name I pray, amen. Well, our story starts back in the time of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. The king in Israel at this time was a guy called Jehoram. It seems Jehoram really didn't serve God that much. He probably was the kind of guy who had he thought he was a big shot, you know what I mean? But God has a way of taking those people and, well, they're not such big shots. What happened this time is the Syrian army or the Aramean army came and they wanted to fight against Samaria, but they didn't fight against them like, come and attack and try to break down the walls. No, they just surrounded the city with their army. Now that doesn't sound so bad, right? But the problem is when they laid siege, that's what it's called, when they laid siege, they made sure no supplies could get into the city. And most cities didn't have a way to grow food, or they had a limited supply of food. So after a while, people started running out of food. They were eating anything and everything. Rats, I'm sure, bugs. If you were rich and you had 80 pieces of silver, you could buy yourself a nice, yummy donkey's head. Ooh. And worse than that, in fact, there was a day when the king was walking on the wall and he heard some women talking about cannibalism. When he heard that, he tore his clothes because it was just, he couldn't take any more. The people could see that the king had sackcloth. He was at least mourning a little bit, trying a little bit to wait for God, but he was tired of waiting for God. He said, I'm tired of waiting for God. This is it. I'm done with it. And you know what? He didn't blame himself for his sins or his people's sins. He blamed Elisha, the man of God, the prophet. And he said, I'm going to have his head cut off him by the time the sun goes down, or God punish me just as bad. Well, he sent some people on ahead to go hold Elisha, but Elisha knew it was happening. In fact, Elisha was sitting with the elders of the city. It seems like the elders of the city were more on Elisha's side than they were on King Jehoram's side. He said, you just hold the door shut. His master's right behind him. He knew the king was coming. Well, wasn't too long before King Jehoram showed up. He and his second in command, his right-hand man, Elisha had a message for him. He says, this is what God says. This time tomorrow in the gates of Samaria, you'll be able to buy a bushel of wheat for $1 and 2 bushels of barley for 50 cents. Now that guy, the right-hand man of the king, he didn't believe that a bit. He looked at Elisha and he said, what? If God opened the windows of heaven, if God opened the floodgates of heaven, that couldn't happen. Boys and girls, nothing's too hard for God. Elisha looked at that man. He says, you'll see it happen with your eyes, but but you won't taste one bit of that food. Well, apparently the king decided he could wait till tomorrow at least, and probably the elders said, I don't think so. But now the scene changes to outside the city. Outside the city we find four, pretty sad individuals. They were lepers. That means they had a terrible skin disease. If you had one of those diseases they called leprosy, you weren't allowed to live with the other people. You had to leave your families and leave the city and leave your life and go live, with other lepers. I suppose in a hut against a wall or a cave or wherever. But those lepers were just in the same problem everybody else. There was no food. And they got to thinking. Sometimes that's good for us to do, to get to thinking, right? They said, if we stay here, we're going to die. That's true. They would starve, right? They said, if we can get into the city, there's no food there either. We'll still die. They said, those Syrians have lots of food. Why don't we go surrender to the Syrians, to the Arameans? Maybe they'll capture us for prisoners. If they do that, they'll feed us and we'll live. But if they don't, the worst that can happen is we'll die. Sometimes, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, God gives you those options. You have nothing to lose but put your trust on God or venture out and something, say, okay, God, I don't know what else to do, so I'm going to do this. That's what they did. Now, God had his plan all along how he's going to take care of his people and take care of that army. And it's interesting. Sometimes we think God needs our help. God did not need those people's help. You see, about that time, it was twilight. Just before dark. Those Syrians had their supper cooking and everything, and all of a sudden they heard it. The rumble of horses' hoofs and chariots. They were worried. They were scared. They thought that King Jehoram had gotten word out to the Egyptians and the Hittites and hired those kings and their armies to fight against them. Now, they weren't afraid of the Israelite army, but they knew they couldn't fight two armies or even three. So all of a sudden, all of them started screaming, "It's the Egyptians! It's the Hittites! Run for your lives!" And in the twilight, in the dark, they all started running. They left their horses and their donkeys and their weapons. In fact, they were running so fast. You know how it is when you're running away from something. If someone's running faster than you, who needs armor? And you got rid of your armor so you could run faster than that guy. And that guy said, who needs a sword? And they were just throwing stuff and dropping stuff so they could be faster than the other guy running away. Since they did that all the way to the Jordan River, if I understand it right, it's almost 20 miles. That's pretty scary, boys and girls. The funny thing is, there was no army. There wasn't anyone. God just caused them to hear the sound of an army. God gave them that sound in their ears somehow, but there wasn't an army. When those men with leprosy got to the camp, they found it abandoned. They found horses and donkeys tied. They found food cooking. They knew what to do that. Good, yummy food. And they ate all they could eat. They went in a tent and they found gold and silver and clothes. And they carried as much as they could carry and went and hid it, maybe in a cave or something. Went in the second tent, the same thing. But there they were. They were eating and enjoying all that. And all of a sudden they stopped. One of them said, we don't do well. We're not doing the right thing. This is a day of good news. If we keep quiet and don't tell, we'll be in trouble for sure. That's a good thing to think about. We as Christians have a lot of good news, but this sounds like this is good news for God's people. We have to be careful to be helpful to all people, but especially to God's people. So they went to the city and called to the porter of the gate and said, hey, you need to listen to us. And he said, what? He said, we got to the Syrian army camp and there wasn't nobody there. The horses were tied, the donkeys were tied, the food was cooking, the money's there, but there was nobody there. So word got to King Jehoram, but he didn't believe it. He said, this is just a trick. They're out hiding and they're waiting for us to come out. And they're going to come out and get us. So someone suggested they take a couple chariot horses and go look, and they did. And they found the trail of cast-off clothes and weapons and stuff all the way to the Jordan River. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Remember way back when we started, this guy, this second in command of the king, that said, well, if God opened the windows of heaven, could that happen? And Elisha said, you'll see it with your eyes, but won't eat any of it. Well, apparently the king put him in charge of the gate of the city. Now, I'm not sure how that went, but I can just imagine him saying, now folks, there's plenty for everyone. Stay calm. Let's do this orderly and neatly, and no running or pushing or shoving. But you know what? They opened the gates and there was running and pushing and shoving, and that guy, that second in command, he got run right over the top of by the people. So many people stepped on him that he died right there in the gate of the city. Just like Elisha said, he saw it, but he didn't get to taste any of it because he didn't believe that God could do what God said he was going to do. Now, boys and girls, this story ends with the people, the people that were in the market in the gates of Samaria that next morning, calling out to who would listen. A bushel of wheat, just $1. 2 bushels of barley, just 50 cents. It was a day of rejoicing and gladness. God had saved his people. God had provided for his people. God did it because that's what God does. Boys and girls, I don't know what's going on with you today. Moms and dads, I don't know what's going on with you today. But God's able to help us. I don't know if you're in the place where you have to keep waiting for God. Or if you're in a place where you say, well, okay, God, I'm going to go ahead and do this. All the things you told me and all the things I understand, I have nothing to lose. Sure not going to hurt me any. Maybe that's your case today. I'm hoping that God will use this to help someone and guide someone to take that step out, to do something so that God can use that something to help them. Thank you very much.